My name's Louise Wilkinson and I'm Professor of Medieval Studies here at the University of Lincoln. Today I'm going to talk to you about one of my favourite subjects, King John and Magna Carta. In June 1215 at Runnymede, King John issued one of the most important documents in English history. This document was Magna Carta, which is known as the Great Charter in English. In 1215, Magna Carta was intended to function as a peace treaty between King John and his barons. It was intended to end a bitter civil war which had erupted in England in response to his harsh government. I'm going to outline for you now then the background to Magna Carta and its relevance in 1215. So King John ruled England between 1199 and 1216, and he presided over one of the most disastrous reigns ever in English history. His reign saw not one, not two, but three great crises. The first crisis came about in 1204 when King John lost Normandy and most of his family's continental lands to the French King Philip Augustus. This meant that King John lost important territories, he also lost valuable revenues, and he also suffered a loss of face as a ruler on the international stage. The second crisis of John's reign came about when he quarrelled with the Pope Innocent III over the appointment of a new Archbishop of Canterbury. Innocent III wanted to promote his own candidate, a Lincolnshire man by the name of Stephen Langton, but John refused to accept him. Innocent became so angry with the king that he actually imposed an interdict, which was a general strike of the clergy, on the whole of England. The interdict lasted from 1208 to 1214 and was a time of great spiritual deprivation for King John's subjects. It also meant that John felt he was placed under pressure because he feared a rebellion among his English subjects too. The third crisis of John's reign was, yes, you guessed it, the Boronia Rebellion that broke out in 1215 in response to his harsh government of England, and which led to the issue of Magna Carta as a hoped-for peace treaty. So why did Boronia Rebellion break out in England in 1215? Well, there were several factors that we can take into consideration here. The loss of Normandy in 1204 meant that for the rest of his reign, John was absolutely obsessed with raising money. He needed to gather a great war chest to fund the recovery of Normandy and his lost continental possessions. In order to raise this money, he taxed his subjects, and in particular his barons, his great lords, felt the pressure of royal government under him. Some baronial families became increasingly indebted to the crown. The sons, daughters and other heirs to great estates found that they were charged increasingly large sums to succeed to their family lands when an earl or baron died. So to give you one example, an important noble lord called Nicholas de Stuteville, who had estates in the north of England, was charged £6,666 by King John to succeed to his brother's estates. The Stuteville family lands in this period only generated an annual income of around £500, so this really was an oppressive amount of money that the king asked from Nicholas de Stuteville. Poor Nicholas. Now, it wasn't just John's great subjects who felt the burden of rule under John. John also placed tremendous financial pressure on other sections of society. This came about through the actions of his royal officials in the counties, through his handling of debts owed to Jewish moneylenders, and also through John's taxation of the lower levels of society when he taxed their income and their movable goods. So John really placed tremendous financial pressure on all levels of English society. Now, as a result of the loss of Normandy, John also spent far more time in England than any of his predecessors, certainly more time than his elder brother Richard I. And John constantly travelled around the kingdom, sometimes staying in places just 2 to 3 nights. And in particular, he came to know the north of England quite well. He came to Lincolnshire and Yorkshire quite regularly. So we know, for example, that he visited Lincoln, where I'm standing, on no fewer than 8 separate occasions during the course of his reign. And so the north of England came to feel the pressure of his government. Now, to make matters worse, John was also a deeply unpleasant personality. He was thoroughly nasty. He demanded the sons and daughters of many of his barons as hostages for their parents' good behaviour. He also was widely believed to have ordered the starvation of a prominent noblewoman and her son, Matilda de Brioze and her son William, in a royal castle. This was something that you just didn't do in this period if you were a king. You did not starve to death the wife of one of your leading barons. So John imposed an incredibly harsh system of government on England, and this system of government was made all the more unpleasant by the king's deeply problematic personality. Now, he might have got away with this had he been successful in his foreign policy, had he raised sufficient treasure to launch a successful campaign for the recovery of Normandy. In 1214, John did launch a campaign to recover his lost continental lands, but this ended in absolute failure. And this had important repercussions in England because it gave his subjects courage to rise up against his rule. And so already in the autumn of 1214, we know from different types of records, opponents were starting to gather together and to draw up lists of grievances against the king. In the spring of 1215, England slipped into civil war, and in May, the barons who opposed John actually took possession of England's capital, London. In Lincoln, our royal castle was actually held for the crown by a very loyal supporter of King John, the great Castellan Lady Nicola de la Haye. She was one of a handful of women who held government office in the Middle Ages. But elsewhere in the county of Lincolnshire, many local knights joined the rebellion against John's oppressive regime. Now, with the outbreak of civil war, by the summer of 1215, both sides in the conflict seemed to have realised that it would be difficult to secure an all-out victory. And so they entered into negotiations. And they came together at a place called Runnymede, near the River Thames, a neutral territory, to negotiate a peace settlement. And it was here at Runnymede that Magna Carta was drafted and issued. And in Magna Carta, when it was issued on the 15th of June 1215, John basically acquiesced to a number of the rebels' demands. Now, Magna Carta is a truly remarkable document. There are just 4 original manuscripts of the 1215 Magna Carta that survive today. There are 2 in the British Library, 1 at Salisbury Cathedral, and there is 1 here in Lincoln, in the possession of the Dean and Chapter of Lincoln Cathedral. Magna Carta is an amazing document. It was a very important document because it attempted to put a whole series of restrictions on John's government of England. It tried to improve his behaviour for the future. So Magna Carta in its original Latin text runs to 3,500 words. It has 63 individual clauses which place all sorts of restrictions on the king's activities. So there were measures within Magna Carta that attempted to protect the English church, its rights and liberties. There were clauses within Magna Carta that attempted to prevent the king in the future from demanding large arbitrary sums of money from his subjects. There were clauses in Magna Carta that protected the king's subjects against the king's treatment of underage heirs and widows. There were clauses in Magna Carta that tried to moderate the behaviour of his royal officials and which also tried to make royal justice fairer and more available to his subjects. So Magna Carta was a tremendously important document in its own time. It was also more than simply a baronial document. Its clauses touched on the interests of all sorts of sections of society. So there were clauses that touched the interests of knights, of lesser landholders and the free peasantry. And Magna Carta itself was addressed to all the free men in England. It really was quite remarkable. Now, unfortunately for John's opponents, John agreed to Magna Carta with very little intention of observing its terms. Magna Carta also included within its clauses a clause that is known today as the Security Clause, Clause 61. And this appointed a group of 25 barons to ensure that John observed the terms of Magna Carta. And more than that, it empowered these men to go with armed knights against the king if he breached its terms. This made Magna Carta completely unpalatable from King John's perspective. By July, he was writing to the Pope Innocent III to seek to have Magna Carta annulled and condemned. Innocent III obliged, and he wrote back, his letters arriving in England in September, and he declared Magna Carta to be shameful and base and unjust. By September, though, England was already back in civil war. The barons were fighting the king's forces quite bitterly across the country. And this civil war was still waging on King John's death from dysentery at Newark Castle in October 1216. So if Magna Carta failed as a peace treaty quite dismally in 1215, why did its reputation and renown live on? Well, I think this is because Magna Carta's contents enshrined the general principle that the king should be subject to the law, not above the law, and this made it incredibly popular among the king's subjects. Magna Carta was actually reissued in the reign of King John's son by the royal government in 1216, 1217 and 1225. And it was the 1225 version that became the definitive version that's on England's statute books. Every time Magna Carta was reissued in Henry III's reign and later, it was proclaimed throughout the realm. It was publicised in the counties. By the 1250s, it was being proclaimed in English, in French, the language of the nobility, and in Latin, the language of the church. And so Magna Carta's fame grew and it became firmly embedded in English society. So that is the importance of Magna Carta.